I had all these secondary characters in my world and I took them all out.
Does every writer need to know how to write a pilot?
Yes. Yes, it is absolutely a necessary skill because it's it's your calling card to get executives to be interested in you, to get showrunners to hire you most of the time, except for those picky ones like me who like to see a spec if you're breaking into the business. And it's ultimately what you will be doing later in your career, because once you reach that mid-level to upper level point, your reps are going to want you to start developing. And developing is all about writing pitch documents and then hopefully selling a show and writing a pilot. So it is absolutely something everyone should know how to do. And, you know, there are plenty of books out there about how to do it. I want to say, I think Cam Miller has a really good book about writing a pilot. Jen Grisanti has all kinds of great material about writing a pilot. So, you know, there's resources out there to help you figure out how to demystify it a little bit. But it's, you know, if you love to tell stories, it's just a specific way of telling a story.
How did you learn to write a pilot?
I learned how to write a pilot, first of all, by just being a huge student of television. There was a time when my friends Charles Murray and Terrence Paul Winter would tease me mercilessly about how I watched every show on television. And it used to be true. It is no longer true. There's too many shows. I can't do it. But I have a list of pilots that, like, when I was writing a new pilot and I was like, oh, the tone doesn't feel quite right. If it was gritty, I had a list of pilots that I would go watch to sort of get my brain in that place, not to take anything from the pilot, but just to have the tone in my head of like, right, 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 this is what I'm going for, and then go back to work on mine. So studying existing pilots is incredibly valuable, and it'll get, you know, give you some guideposts for how they did it, what the pacing of those pilots were. You know, different types of pilots can have a different rhythm to them. If you're doing a big like fantasy show and you have to, you know, launch it in the pilot, what some shows put in that pilot is going to be very different than if you're launching an ensemble drama full of a bunch of characters who work in a hospital, right? The specifics of what you need in those pilots are very different. So I would study pilots like the one you want to write and get a feel for, you know, where they put the act breaks if it's a show that has act breaks. You should always be breaking your stories with act breaks, P.S. Even if you're not going to have them in your script, even if it's a streaming show, break it with act breaks, because it will keep you with a nice ebb and flow of action and emotion in your episode. Unlike some shows that you watch on streaming where nothing happens for like 37 minutes and then the last 10 minutes, everything happens. So give yourself that break. Write it like you have to do a commercial break, and it'll really help you find some good ups and downs in your storytelling.
Of those lists of pilots in the different sort of genre or style that you wanted to sort of delve into, did they age out after a while? Did things become too slow after maybe 10 years? You know, how as life has sped up?
I would say no. I think great pilots are always great pilots. You know, some of the ones that I still go back to, like I tell young writers who are asking me, like, what pilot should I watch? They should always, always, always watch the pilot of Hill Street Blues, which is the greatest show in the history of television. I will fight anyone who tries to say otherwise. Because every show that came after it that people want to say is the greatest show in the history of television only exists because Stephen Bochco was able to pull that pilot off, because it's, you know, it changed the game in terms of how television was made. Wise Guy is one of the most amazing TV pilots. I always recommend it to people. The Miami Vice pilot, crazy. Like, you probably could not get away with the Miami Vice pilot now because the two main characters don't meet each other for an hour. But it's still worth looking at because the character work is so really, really like interesting, and you know so much about those people by the end of that pilot. It's kind of like, wow, okay. Homicide: Life on the Street, one of the greatest pilots ever. The character introduction of Frank Pembleton is one of the greatest character introductions I've ever seen. Like, you know everything you will ever need to know about Frank Pembleton from his search for his car. Everything you will ever need to know. So watching those really great shows, even if they're 10, 20, 30 years old, the work in them doesn't age out. Maybe the pacing ages out. Maybe, you know, because Hill Street Blues was what, 52 minutes and episodes, and now it's, you know, 43 minutes. So they're longer. They can linger more in some of the, you know, silences of the characters and things. The driving scene, like people really literally driving down roads, and you're like, no, nobody has time for that anymore. But the character work, the dialogue work, the ideas in the shows, the way they execute things, that never ages out. Great pilots never age out in that way.
What about watching bad pilots as another way to teach yourself?
Bad pilots is also good. I mean, bad pilots is subjective. I think even more so than great pilots, because I think, right, you could Google like Alan Sepinwall telling you what he thought the 10 greatest pilots were. He probably differs from me, but like that's going to be a solid list of pilots, right? Bad pilots, it kind of is about what was bad about it, right? So I think that's an interesting study. Like if you asked your 10 of your friends, what was the worst TV pilot you ever watched? And then go watch them, you could still learn. Like, I think one of the biggest mistakes that pilots make is, especially nowadays, the studios and the networks are like, more twists, more twists, more twists. And you're just exhausted by the end of the pilot. You're like, I was done three twists ago. That was enough. I didn't need the other things. Like, give me those later. So it's too much happening in the pilot, right? And that's a battle right now because that's what they're asking us to do. But it's too much. Sometimes just too much. And you need to say it's too much. It's overwhelming story. Nobody's going to want to come back. Sometimes it's about the focus being off, like that whoever your lead character is, maybe it's casting, maybe it's writing, who knows, is losing focus to another character. And so it feels a little all over the place. And it's like, well, why didn't they fix that? Why didn't they realize it, right? There's a lot of things that can go wrong in a pilot. Sometimes it's just the directing's bad. And you're like, wow, this was a really good script. It's like, too bad they didn't have a better director because it feels flat and like not good. And you know they spent a ton of money on it, but it doesn't feel like it. You don't see it on screen. So it's an interesting exercise to sort of just make yourself think about like, what would I have done different if it was my show?
What questions does a writer need to be asking themselves while they're writing a pilot?
I'd say first and foremost, always be clear on why you're writing it. What about it is interesting to you? What message are you trying to convey? Why? Why does it need to exist? Because I guarantee you, if it's not a thing you've already sold, when you go out to have conversations about it, people are going to be like, so why did you write this pilot? You're going to get it. So know why you're doing it, because it'll also keep you really focused in the writing process. I was working on a pilot once, and I had written the outline, and I had outlined two pilots at the same time and chose to write another one first. So I came back to this one and was like, great, now I'm going to write this. And as I was writing it, I just had this overwhelming sense of like, oh, no, something's wrong, something's wrong. And what I realized is, having done so many cop shows, usually the secondary characters, you want to write for them in the writer's room, and the studio and the network are like, nobody cares, nobody cares. Too many, like, we're focused on this. And so I had all these secondary characters in my world, and I took them all out because I was like, maybe later these characters could exist, but in this pilot, nobody cares. And so I had to then go back and weave in really important story points that those characters had once carried, because that information was still important to my story, but the characters weren't. So it was like, right, you're pulling focus away from this really important story that you're trying to tell about a woman whose personal and professional life has been upended by having these other people in the mix. So because I knew she was the most important thing to me in the story, I was able to be like, something's wrong, what is it? And then I finally figured it out.
So you were having too much of these ancillary characters steal sort of screen time?
Yes.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, still screen time. And more so than screen time, it's trying to steal importance, right? Because in a pilot, you want every character to pop a little bit, or it's why are they in there, right? So suddenly you're trying to create moments for all these sort of second tier characters, but I want all the moments to be with like the 4 people I'm most invested in who are all tied to my main character. So I was like, we don't really need all these. I will wipe the decks clear and then get all those moments of, and that script has gotten me so many meetings and so much development opportunity because I did that, because I narrowed the focus. So why you're writing it's really important. I think who your audience is. If you're writing a pilot that feels very broadcast to you, let it be broadcast. Don't try to make it, well, maybe it's also a cable pilot though. No, sometimes it's fine for a pilot to just feel like a broadcast pilot. And sometimes you're going to write something that's like grittier and a little more cutting edge, and it's very clearly a streaming pilot, and that's fine. Write it that way. It's hard when you write things that are right down the middle, because then everyone's a little confused by where it goes. Like, what's your target for this? Who are you thinking of? So if you think ahead of time, like I have a pilot that I wrote that is very specifically, I wrote it as an FX pilot because I wanted to show that I could do that like premium cable sort of feel, right? Even though FX is regular cable, it's pretty premium fare on that channel. So I was like, I'm going to do that. I have one pilot that's very specifically an HBO pilot because I was like, okay, I can do this. It's not necessarily how I want most of my shows to be, but I can do this. And this show fits the mold, so I'm going to write it. And then I have shows that are straight broadcast or more like Disney Plus-y kind of genre sort of stuff. Just sort of know in your head, like, because again, it's a question you're going to get asked, right? If you write that pilot and an exec's interested in it or a producer's interested in it, they're going to say, so where'd you see this? So know where you see it as you're writing it.
And if we use that example of a woman whose professional and personal life are sort of upended, when they asked you, why did you write this? What was
my answer? It was at a time when several stories in the media and on television, quite frankly, had coalesced for me in this idea of women who had done hard things in their lives being expected to be ashamed of it. Women who maybe had done sex work or done whatever, needing to feel shame. And I rejected that. I was like, no, like these women survived. They did what they had to do to stay alive, and they are survivors, and they have built wonderful lives for themselves. And why should they have to feel guilty about this thing that they did? And so everything about her story is a rebuttal of that idea. It is about a woman who made some really, really difficult choices when she was young and owns them. And it's not like she's proud of them and wants to flaunt them all the time, but she refuses to feel shame about them.